Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. I have Zach with me today. Zach, who is our guest?
Well, today we're welcoming back historian, blogger, YouTuber, and to be honest, just all-round good guy, Josh Provan, as we talk about the rise and the fall of the Iroquois. And if we don't somehow shoon in some comments about the last of the Mohicans, then I'm going to be honest with you, Alex, we're just doing a crap job.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be the first time. But I'm pretty sure Josh is only here because he's collecting cartoons of himself anyway. So,
well, my family is. I don't know about myself. I do. This is the not so secret of how you pull people into this show. To be honest, we all come for the caricatures.
This is true. It's genius.
Marketing wise, you've knocked out of the park with this one. I mean. It's well done. It's well done. This is the high level strategy.
Yeah,
high level strategy.
Today, I've just been sent one of me in the most politically incorrect, historically inaccurate, heathen costume from the First Crusade, which is what I asked for. To be fair, I love it. It's brilliant.
I think I may have seen it.
Yes, it's
in the group.
Anyway. We're here because Josh likes to move around the world with us and bring us bits of history that we wouldn't otherwise look at. We're still waiting for someone to come forward and fund our fact-finding pronunciation mission to Hawaii. No one's offered any money yet, but Zach's having a shit week as well. And so if you could pay for Zach to come, then obviously the historical accuracy of Polynesia would thank you, and so would Zach.
Absolutely. If somebody wants to chuck me, a few £1,000s to do research, I'm up for it. I'm not cheap, but
It's either that or a real job, and we really don't want to do that.
This is necessary research. Remember, patrons who are listening, Hawaii. In Hawaii, it needs to be done. No one else is doing it.
But today you're taking us somewhere else. We're staying in the Western Hemisphere. A lot of our listeners will be aware of the Iroquois' interactions with European settlers in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries because of Daniel Day-Lewis and other things. But where do they come from geographically and historically? Who are these people?
Well, it's my pleasure to try and tell you about them and raise the ire of the modern day nations if they happen to be listening at the same time. Well done, by the way, getting Daniel Day-Lewis in there right off the bat.
Yep.
You don't need to. You're doing your job properly.
Drinking game for anyone. If every time we mention Last of the Mohicans, you get to drink.
Absolutely. I mean, I've heard that podcasters who don't include a minimum of relatable and intellectually comforting pop culture references to other people's intellectual property do get fined and publicly shamed. I do think that's a thing now.
100%.
But, so, who are the Iroquois? Where do they come from? Well, to answer both in the broadest and most unsatisfyingly general way possible, I'd have to say that the Iroquois are a collection of 5 and later 6 tribes who shared a common root language and matrilineal culture distinct from other language groups who lived in present-day northeastern USA and Canada. Geographically, these initial 5 tribes, the Oneida, Mohawk, Cayuga, Seneca, and Onondaga, lived more or less contiguously with each other in a corridor of land between Lake Ontario and the line of Lake Champlain and the Hudson River Valley. Research into the early history of the region suggests an initial connection to the Algonquin peoples, and Jesuit histories tell that the originators of the 5 tribes actually came from what is now Canada in the region of what the French call Montreal. See if you can guess where that is in Anglophone. And were driven south after an unsuccessful war. The name, coincidentally, with Montreal, is entirely French and derived from a foggy understanding of a vague word used by the Algonquins to describe them. and may even mean something like snake or something like that. But there's various sort of explanations as to what it's derived from. But European phonetic renderings of indigenous languages is really common in popular names of most American Indian tribes. The Iroquois called themselves for themselves, they called themselves the Haudenosaunee, or the people of the Longhouse.
So initially, these people, they're quite warlike, but they quite literally end up burying the hatchet. And I mean that in the literal sense. This is where the term burying the hatchet comes from. And until I was researching the questions, I didn't even know that. So talk us through the story of how these tribes kind of set aside their differences and become a union. Because it all starts, I was reading, with the Tears of Hiawatha.
Well, yeah, I mean, or at least that's where I always like to start when I tell the story. Around 1450, though some say it happened as early as the 1100s, the Iroquois nations that had settled along the southern shores of the Great Lakes were locked in a self-perpetuating cycle of raid and counter-raid and low-level warfare. A common byproduct of the rivalry amongst the tribes of the area was the concept of a mourning war, where loved ones killed or captured in battle could be avenged, replaced even by a captive or corpse of an enemy nation. The casualty, a major casualty of these times, and probably this specific instance, was a man named Hiawatha, which is pronounced generally as Hiawatha, and he later became famous in American folklore due to the publication of The Song of Hiawatha by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Hiawatha was a real man, though, and he was descended from the Onondaga people, but became a Mohawk leader. And he was renowned for his eloquence and his wisdom. And he had come to believe in the teachings of a Huron mystic named Dikanawida, who preached a message of togetherness and peace and the power that could be derived from that. Because Dikanawida apparently had a speech impediment, or at least he wasn't as eloquent as he was divinely inspired, Hiawatha would often speak for him. The great law of peace and power, as it was called, preached by Dikanawida and his disciples, however, was despised by many, such as the warlike and sinister Tadodaho of the Onondaga, whose worst impulses were egged on by a cruel physical deformity that left him in constant pain and embitterment. Tadodaho was a spectre of fear amongst the Iroquois. His hair was matted and tangled, and legend said that snakes grew in it. It was also said that he had the power to kill from a great distance without seeing his enemy. Amongst all the tribes, he was the most powerful and feared, and although the Mohawk, Seneca, Oneida, and Cayuga were willing to accept the great law, Tadodaho refused, and his refusal was costly to Hiawatha in unimaginable ways. 3 times a grand council was attempted, and each time Tadodaho quashed it. And deliberately thereafter, or in the course of, targeted Hiawatha as Diganawida's living tongue, as it were, killing all 3 of his daughters by either magic or assassination. I'm not actually quite sure the specifics of it, but he did this unspeakable evil. Now, the significance of this is very important, I think. Hiawatha was a man of peace, and he helped to preach that vengeance wasn't the way. He was, however, entitled to take vengeance on the man who had killed his daughters, and indeed replace them with captives under, contemporary sort of sensibilities. So if Tadodaho could push Hiawatha to vengeance, then Diganawida's great law could crumble. I mean, the whole reason behind it, if you take out his most trusted disciple. It's just a really effective way of trying to pierce to the heart of something you just didn't want to get on board with. Mm. However, Dikanawida was wise, though, and he nursed and coached his friend through these dark times by the shores of Lake Onondaga, teaching him special rites to enact that would help him process his grief, cleanse his soul, and come back to some sort of humanity or something like that. How he did that, I mean, this is like unspeakable pain the poor guy was in, but somehow he managed it. And so the tears of Hiawatha, I feel, symbolically take the place of the spilled blood. And the team continued their work. But they knew that unless Tadadaho could be persuaded, and again, they could have killed him and just got him out of the way, but they wanted to actually persuade him to change his mind. But you know, this guy's going to be a tough negotiation, I think, by any stretch of the word, because he just wouldn't listen to anybody, and he was just determined to maintain his power base through raiding and fear and whatever magic he had on his side. So, what did they do? How did they get to him at last? Well, there was a woman who lived on a very popular warpath, or one of the main warpaths in quotes, of the region, and her house was a place where warriors of any nation could find hospitality, and she gained an invaluable insight into all manners of affairs as a result of this. She was known as Jikonsase, which, to be honest, has several interpretations depending on how old the source is. But she's most commonly known as the Mother of Nations. And Jikonsase advised the great peacemaker how to win Tadadaho to the cause. Through her efforts, a meeting was arranged, and Tadadaho consented to let the Ganawida and Hiawatha enact special sort of ceremonies over him. So special ointments and healing ceremonies were used to soothe the pain in his bones and joints. And then Hiawatha solemnly combed his hair smooth. Now, think about that. That's a moment right there. I mean, Hiawatha is combing Tadadaho's hair. The man who killed his daughters is literally at his mercy. Can you imagine how much he must have wanted to strangle him?
I'm just looking at your hair and thinking, I can imagine Zach combing your ponytail.
Yeah. See, what I'm thinking about is the nightmare, because you were saying that this guy basically had a rat's nest for a hair right?
Yeah.
So how long must that have taken? So not only have you got to resist the impulse to throttle the guy, it's going to take all day. And I'm just wondering, does he kind of, when he gets to a really knotty bit, does he just give it a really good yank?
Yeah,
That's a kind of cathartic way of getting over the whole kind of agony that he's in.
I think
there's something distinctly unmanly if the other guy squeals, so he might bite his tongue.
But
it's very symbolic, this story. I love it.
Yeah, but it apparently it works. You know, once he's freed of his pain, he encounters some sort of catharsis or something like that occurs in Tadadaho, and he suddenly accepts the great peace that the Ganawida is offering, probably sweetened by the fact that the Ganawida allows him to remain as the most powerful chief of the league. He's known as the Firekeeper, and Iroquois national sort of politics would forever rest on Onondaga as a result of him accepting the great peace, or the great law, as sometimes it was called. He's sort of the spokesperson there for the rest of his life. And actually, subsequent, in quotes, firekeepers were actually called the ritual name Tadadaho because he was the first. So a great council is then held in which the war hatchet is ceremonially buried in the earth. 5 arrows are lashed together as a symbol of unity. A grand longhouse is constructed at Onondaga, and a magnificent white pine planted as a symbol of the strength of the great peace. And if anybody is sort of aware of the heraldic nature of the United States crest, then you'll notice the eagle, which is also a symbol of the Iroquois, is holding lashed together arrows in one of its talons.
See, there's a lot of symbolism in this creation story, isn't there? You've got the burying of the hatchet, the binding of the arrows, planting the great white pine. Why is this creation story kind of so philosophical? Because it goes back to what Alex is saying about all of the symbolism here. Is it just
the nature of it? Is that what we're seeing here? The nature of passing things down by word of mouth?
Yeah, I mean, is this kind of Chinese whispers in action?
Well, I mean, there's probably an element to it, because obviously all of these stories, although they refer to real people, were passed down by word of mouth and then told as formulaic kind of stories around campfires and stuff from that time down to the fall of the Iroquois, and to this day, to be honest. Although, as I say, each of the four main characters do seem semi-mythical, and so this is due to that oral tradition, they were real people. There's no reason to not believe that they have some actual. There were actual people who formed the Iroquois nation together, and they were probably rough. There's probably grains of truth at the heart of all of them. And it's quite common as well in this part of North America to find holy men at various important times in history trying to unite the various nations to sort of gather strength. So that's a big thing. Of course, certain things probably did get embellished over time, but the core meaning of the story in its various forms is always the triumph of peace and togetherness. The Kanawide, or the great peacemaker, is holy man. In this case, as with many divinely inspired figures in history, politics and economics, which are like a significant factor in the unification, does take second place to this philosophical message. For a start, the improvement of bulk crops like grain and corn was vital to the economic viability of the experiment. The Iroquois weren't friendly to everybody either. Once they were unified, they were in a very strong position to pool collective resources, absorb other tribes, crush enemies, and in fact, although they were now tied together as allies, the Five Nations all still they all sort of still did their own thing to an extent. It's just they didn't fight each other anymore, and they acted as a unit to support the other in external matters if it was a serious deal. But even in that, Onondaga didn't dictate to all, because in 1749, there's a great quote by a British observer who said that, and quote, "Such was their absolute notions of liberty, that they would allow no kind of superiority one over the other, and banish all servitude from their territories." Unquote. So the ritualistic nature of the story became embedded in the culture and ceremony of the League, basically.
How do they communicate this? Is it literally just, fireside chats over the course of time? Is it kind of encapsulated in song? Do they have kind of ritual days and ceremonies? How's it done?
I'm unsure as to if there were historically specific days on which the sort of like a founding day of the Iroquois. I don't know whether that was a thing, but for certain, the like Hiawatha, Jikansahe, and the Ganawida would be celebrated in songs and dances and remembered on significant sort of religious festivals and things like that. I'm absolutely sure. And also, again, just told around the firesides in the longhouses as the story of the Iroquois.
How does the piece that follows impact on the everyday lives of the Iroquois people?
Okay. Always easy questions.
Yeah.
But
Not to give you like an essay question that would usually require a couple of months of solid reading and sorting. But yeah, I'm just going to chuck it at you because it's fun.
I will do my best to bat it back. So at a social level, we'll say that the Confederacy works, as I mentioned before, on a matrilineal system. So basically the women own most of the property, even after marriage.
I like
The clan matrons of the tribes also have the last word in most disputes and a very strong voice in political decisions. It's difficult to well, it's common to underestimate how much political power these women had. Militarily speaking, the Confederacy is also able to expand and dominate the area below the Great Lakes and along the Hudson and Ohio valleys. Wampum Belts, or Hiawatha Belts, as they were sometimes known, became a highly important symbolic tool of communication and diplomacy. This also ties into the founding legend because wampum shells strung into strands and then into wider belt, more decorative belts, were a tool that the Ganawida had used to spread his message, and they were highly symbolic to him and to the Iroquois thereafter. As a result, they were now, and they became a symbolic tool of communication and diplomacy. Thereafter, in the century and a half, well, all the centuries that followed for the Iroquois, to be honest, and actually many tribes not within the Iroquois Confederacy also used this method. These were at first made out of freshwater shells, very beautiful, when they're all strung together. The little tiny little shells, pure pale white, and later on they would make patterns out of the slightly discolored ones and make pictures out of them. And later on, this changed when European trade became more prevalent, that the wampum belts were more colorful and could actually include either painted shells or, as was very, very common later on, beadwork. But generally speaking, so if you wanted to make peace, you pass the peace belt. If you want to just give it as a gift, as a matter of regard, that's how you do sort of interdiplomacy. And if you want to go to war, the war belt is passed around the Six Nations, and it means you have to go to Onondaga to figure out who we're going to fight. So
okay, so I like that. You decide to go to war before you decide who you're going to fight.
Well, presumably there's a target in mind, but you have to talk to other people about it first. Who knows? Maybe it was just random. We have to go to war with someone this year. It's part of the quota. I don't know. But so all of this is to say that, like I said, they pulled their resources together, made them very powerful in their local area, which is sort of around modern-day New York, Pennsylvania, Great Lakes area. And their dominant position obviously meant that for ordinary people, this was a time of fairly decent living, I would say. Although they were set up in terms, sort of agricultural terms, pretty well set up agriculturally. The territories that came to dominate by the time of the 17th century were a fertile resource for pelts. Now, in the late 1600s, Europeans have founded permanent settlements along the coast, New England and Virginia, the Carolinas. The French influences centered along the St. Lawrence at Montreal. French explorers like Lavie and Champlain had been amongst the first to make contact with the Iroquois, with rather mixed results. And the legacy of this is that the French and the Iroquois became pretty embittered enemies as the French began supporting their traditional foes of the Iroquois, who in turn disliked the Iroquois because of their expansionist nature and wanted to team up with the French to try and stop them. A bitter series of wars erupted through the entire 17th century, and this was ostensibly tied to gaining control of the pelt-rich regions along the Canadian border and around the Great Lakes, known as the Beaver Wars. And this eventually sees French power quite firmly established, and a turning point has come into the Confederacy. But the power of traditional enemies such as the Huron Confederacy has been badly crippled. So it was actually more of a stalemate sort of thing going on. But it would be fair to say that for the Iroquois, the in quotes Pax Iroquois between 1450 and 1600 were flourishing times for your average member of the Confederacy.
So the Europeans pitch up. The Iroquois are busily minding their own business, getting on with their own affairs. Along come the Europeans and think, look, there's some money to be made here. We're going to stick our noses in, because the Europeans do love to do that sometimes. What do they make, first of all, of the Iroquois, where you have such a strong matriarchal influence? Because Western European society is so strongly patriarchal. It must have been a bit of a culture shock for them. What, the women are in charge? Surely not.
I love it though. Can you imagine?
Absolutely.
yeah, they are, and they've got like battle axes and stuff. So deal with it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't understand. They don't recognize it. It goes over their heads. They don't, because it's also quite a subtle thing. The women don't go out to do the diplomacy and stuff like that. They'll use chiefs and stuff to do that, unless the woman is particularly renowned, in which case she'll go herself. But even then, I think that would be taken as a very extreme measure, because it would be seen undignified, I guess, for the Iroquois to actually send their most important political decision makers as if they were message boys. And so the clan matrons of the various nations tended to keep their own counsel, and because as you were saying, as the nature of the way Europeans thought, they didn't really actively ever go to talk with the policymakers amongst the women of the Iroquois. This was missed entirely, and only a few people who actually, pardon my French, gave a damn about actual Indian affairs knew about this. And as a result, unfortunately, because the way, obviously, the way the Iroquois society worked was the women did their thing, the men did their thing, and the twain did meet, but generally speaking, you did actually deliberately had to ask one or the other to get their opinion on it, and they wouldn't just say, well, go ask the women, sort of thing like that, or go ask the men. Ethnographers and historians from the Europeans missed this point, and generally speaking, it led to a great amount of confusion, because obviously a whole element of Iroquois decision making was lost on a lot of people, except the most dedicated sort of, I guess, Indian agents, you'd call them, from the French and the British. And it's just a thing, the Iroquois and Cherokee and other matrilineal societies all along the East Coast all had this in their society, where they would always include the women in decisions, and mostly, generally speaking, the women would tell them what to do, and they would have to enact it. It just, this, like I say, I think it was completely missed by the majority of governors and stuff in the colonies, and so that's a flaw, a major flaw in dealing with the Iroquois. So the simple answer is confusion arose.
Yeah.
And you were talking about the French,
Mm-hmm.
and how they kind of get drawn into
some French bashing. You go dive in
straight in.
Yeah.
Look, I tried to kind of tie it up neatly with some kind of precursor.
Wait, Marcus wouldn't even have done the bridge. He would have just gone, so the French.
I'm trying to make a semblance of being nice to the French.
Go on, I'll let you do it. Style it out. I want to see where this is going.
We're going to edit it out anyway, let's be honest.
I'm really not now, because this is funny. Go on.
So the French, I'm reluctant to say they get suckered into fighting against the Iroquois. But do they basically get suckered into fighting against the Iroquois because they get pally with the Iroquois' enemies first? Is it just, they come in thinking that they're going to play this great game, and actually they get used as a pawn within the broader kind of geopolitical shenanigans that are going on between the tribes at this point?
Well, we could. I'm sure we'll get into how the Iroquois managed to kind of stay afloat during the rivalry between the Europeans, but the French position is a curious one, actually, because they don't actually send the massive sort of teams of people to set up colonies. At first, they send out like small expeditions led by one guy, and they map ridiculous amounts of swathes of North America. The early clashes they have with the Iroquois, and the reason, I mean, the Iroquois is a French name for a reason, because they're the first people to have reported on them, does, I think, color the French stance in North America, because as far as the Iroquois are concerned, the French are sort of like a kind of I want to say they treated them a little like a tribe of North America, a nation within North America. And then the French were relatively happy for this to be the case. And as a result, they teamed up with everybody that the Iroquois had, ticked off. And at first, as in there's actually a lot of cases with European interference in North America, it can be argued that it's not necessarily the Europeans taking advantage of the Native American sort of situation to destroy their enemies. It's actually a bit of both, where you have smaller confederacies who are being bullied by the Iroquois, basically saying, let's team up and show these guys where to go. Unfortunately, that drives the Iroquois into the arms of the Dutch and the English, and already you're getting kind of who sides are being drawn for future conflicts.
So, in terms of, we talked about economical and political and how they impact, but there's a physical impact, isn't there? So they're bringing diseases that Native Americans haven't got any immunity to, and sicknesses, and also we bring them alcohol as well, and it royally screws with them. How accurate is that assumption?
Obviously, the impact of the Europeans on the nations of the Americas is a big subject. Again, thanks for the easy questions.
All right, okay, just the Iroquois. Just the Iroquois. Do we make them all drunkards, and do we give them...
Well, I'll try and give you a nuanced answer. Okay.
Good luck with that.
Yeah. So specifically for the Iroquois, the introduction of, like I say, the new political players complicates matters, and for the most part halts their expansion. In 1722, you do get the Tuscarora Nation inducted into the Confederacy. We have to point that out. So it becomes the Six Nations, which is what they're known as today. However, the Iroquois realized that the Europeans, as you touched on before, Zach, relatively easy to manipulate. And despite being eventually, despite eventually making peace with much stronger and more trade-hungry France through the late 17th century and up to the 18th century, they successfully managed to maintain their power base by playing the British off against the French. The Iroquois were able to survive war with the French because the French had a more sophisticated policy when it came to Indian affairs. And again, that's because of trade. The lifeblood of New France was the fur trade. And for this, they needed to cultivate allies. And as I said before, that worked out pretty well because the Iroquois had made a lot of people angry. Land wasn't necessarily their primary objective. They tended to build forts rather than settlements, unlike the very populous English colonies along with, which became the United States. So this allowed the Confederacy to survive after military failures against the French king, who, for your information, was known in America as an onontio, which I think is something like Great Father or something like that. So, for example, they would begin by being friendly to both the British and the French. Diplomatic missions actually traveled to London to meet King George and other people. And when asked to go raiding for one side or the other during outbreaks of European wars, they would delay for various reasons, then send word to the opposition of the plan and hopefully kill it dead so they didn't have to go and fight anybody. This isn't to say that various nations within the League always stayed neutral. There were, for instance, a branch of the Mohawks, the bulk of whom were usually pro-British, who preferred the French. But this adept manipulation of European rivalries ended in 1755, which we'll get to next, I think. But it wasn't necessarily just sort of the presence of Europeans that caused the problems. In terms of alteration of society, due to the sort of introduction of European diseases and alcohol, this absolutely has its role to play. Disease, now should be added to the list of reasons many tribes begin to disappear. Well, it has before, but in this part of the country, again, you're looking at disease now being added to the list of many local tribes that the Iroquois had been in touch with for a long time, beginning to disappear. And indeed, the Iroquois would sometimes actually take advantage of tribes weakened by disease and alcoholism. And actually, alcoholism, like you say, was a problem. And as an example, we can go to the great orator and war chief, whose name was Red Jacket in English. And he described the results of his struggle here. He said that, in quote, "Red Jacket was once a great man, and in favor with the Great Spirit. He was a lofty pine amongst the smaller trees of the forest. But after years of glory, he degraded himself by drinking the fire water of the white man. The Great Spirit has looked upon him in anger, and his lightning has stripped the pine of its branches." And I think this is a somewhat common story. It's a stereotype, however, to think that everybody just became drunkards, and many did not do so. But it was a problem, even for great leaders amongst the League. But many coastal tribes had certainly already paid enormous price in terms of the population and land by 1750. The Iroquois had to some extent avoided it because of the geographic location of where they were. More importantly, the tribes of the Great Lakes, being removed from large centers of European settlement, were being affected as well by Protestant and Jesuit missionaries, and trade goods such as metal tools, European textiles, guns, and by the time of the French and Indian War, one writer said that it was almost impossible to find a piece of native manufacture that wasn't made from some sort of European materials. Even the Wampum Belt, as I said before, that the Iroquois had been using as a means of diplomatic and communication for centuries, were now mostly made of trade beads and not freshwater shells, as in the time of Hiawatha.
So we do, to some extent, bring them booze.
Yeah.
If they're not drinking booze, what are they drinking? Because the whole point about why booze really takes off in Western European society, if I got this right, is because they can't trust the water quality. Mm. So how are they getting around that?
I would love to answer that question for you, Zach, but to be honest with you, I don't actually know.
I don't think they've got a problem with the water.
No, I don't
quality.
think.
I don't think it's not like in London. Yeah, the water was so disgusting that you drank beer, but I don't think the Iroquois have got that problem.
I would tend to agree. I think that there was brewed from the water sources that they had, possibly a different kind of drink.
Yeah.
And possibly connected with corn. I'm not quite sure precisely. I have a hazy memory of something like this, but I would not want to give listeners some sort of idea.
We'd be better off sitting here discussing how to make time travel happen, because no one wants to answer that question.
Brilliant question as it is.
Yeah, he's like, brilliant question as it is. It's not on the list, arsehole. So get back to the list. Right, okay. Zach, I'll let you do the next question because it's about the French.
So the Iroquois, as you've said, are able to play the British and the French off against each other until 1754. When we get the French and Indian Wars, which is, for folks who don't know, part of the wider 7 Years' War. And then, as everybody knows, Daniel Day-Lewis comes along, stars in Last of the Mohicans, except that it's not like that at all. So what's the historical reality of what happens during the conflict?
Right.
And please don't crush my hope that bit was real, where they ripped his heart out of his body and ate it.
That was a thing. Sure, that was a thing. I mean, what I didn't mention before, actually, what was kind of what I should mention is that back in the old days, when the Great Peace was introduced, cannibalism was a thing, and the Ganuida was one of the people who said, actually, that's not a really cool thing to do. We should stop that, and that was one of the things the Iroquois stopped doing after the Great Peace occurred. But yeah, it could be a thing to cut out the heart of your opponent and boil it and eat it. Also as a form of just a downright form of torture. There was apparently one British soldier during this war who was captured, who saw who saw some rather grisly things regarding the biology of his fellow captors, who were captured by various French allied tribes. But anyway, at first, the Iroquois attempted to establish, well, as you may have gathered from what I said before, the playing off again of the Europeans depended basically on them trying to maintain some sort of neutrality. And so at first the Iroquois attempted to continue this policy of general neutrality with the usual soft prevarication and gentle encouragement, which had worked before. This time, however, the war was bigger. And the Americas were actually a major theater of the conflict. And the position of the Iroquois was made difficult because of the strategic position, and because increasing amounts of European influence had altered their ability to remain aloof from the conflict. The key factor in their ability to stay out of it were the Mohawks. Their inability to stay out of it, I should say, was the Mohawks. The most eastern branch of the Confederacy, who were split in sympathy between the branches of Canajoharie, who liked the British, and Kanawha, who were committed to the French. The British Indian agent William Johnson, who is one of these guys who cared and was actually embedded with the tribe, learned how they did things, and was a good friend to them, actually. As well as, unfortunately, having to do the will of the king, which means like dragging them into a war. But he were being deeply embedded with the Canajoharie Mohawks, the closest of Britain's Mohawk allies. He even had a mistress, an effective wife, who was a well-liked Christian Mohawk woman named Molly Brant. When it came to European wars, like I say, he's going to be the guy who's going to be talking to them and trying to convince them to come and fight with their ally King George. But the Iroquois never actively stopped individual warriors from going and fighting if they wanted to. And this time was no different. In 1755, a pro-British chief, and I'm saying chief, using the word chief here, but that's kind of anachronistic because in Iroquois language and amongst the eastern tribes along the Ohio Valley down to Tennessee and stuff, they're referred to as, and I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this, but it's either Sachem or Sachem. Mm-hmm. But that's the proper terminology for it. This guy, who's called Hendrick Tainagoan, took up the hatchet beside his Irish friend, and led a party of volunteers alongside Johnson's militia to attack the French at Crown Point. A brutal battle took place on the shores of Lake George, in which the French were defeated, but Hendrick was killed. Now, importantly here, something to remember as we go on, Mohawks fought on either side, but when the Kanawha, it's gone out of my head, Kanawha warriors refused to, found out the other Mohawks were with the British, they refused to fight. And this is seen as one of the reasons why the French lost the battle. But at this fight, interestingly enough, as a guy we'll hear of later, was Molly Brant's 13-year-old son, Tyon Danaga, known as Joseph. This event, the Battle of Lake George, helped bring the Mohawks into the fight with the British, and eventually the Confederacy would kind of be sort of pulled into the conflict by the Mohawks, and fought alongside them. So when for instance, when the French fought at Niagara came under siege in 1759, 900 Iroquois were present, Joseph amongst them. And it also should be noted here that warfare along the Ohio, St. Lawrence, and Hudson valleys was next to impossible without large concentrations of Indian allies. When the Marquis de Montcalm attacked Fort William Henry in 1757, he had over 2,000 warriors from France's network of Indian allies. This, by the way, is the actual setting for the Last of the Mohicans. It should further be noticed that, with the exception of the Mohawks, most tribes favored, like I said, the the trade-hungry French rather than the land-hungry British.
Mm.
But when the French were defeated, it sort of looked as if the Iroquois had made the right call. Their allies, the British, were now dominant across the north, but at the same time, the peace between Britain and France did ignore the interests of the Iroquois, with the British content to keep Indian affairs out of international diplomacy, thinking that such matters would be covered, as it always had been, at a colonial level. However, this sort of ungrateful attitude made the British few friends, and had it not been for the influence of Johnson, a great many dissatisfied warriors might have joined the great Indian uprising known as Pontiac's War, which occurred between 1763 and 1766. As it was, the pro-French tribes and factions within the Iroquois, certainly amongst the Seneca, did join in that war, which was a very, very scary time for the British in North America, because actually for a moment it looked as if they were going to lose an awful lot of territory. But these were to become the last of Britain's problems in North America as the 1760s wore on.
Right. We've got to the bit that I really want to ask you, which is, we're talking about whether it's better or worse for the Iroquois to be, for the French or the British to win this, and for them to be in league with. Arguably, to what extent did the American Revolution then end up destroying the Iroquois?
Well, the simple answer is that it did end up destroying the Iroquois. The slightly more in-depth answer for the podcast now follows.
For the people that have been waiting for 45 minutes to get to the big question at the end, yeah.
So, interestingly, from an Iroquois point of view, the American Revolution was an affair of British separatists versus the British government over taxes, which they didn't really understand. What's the fuss, guys? I mean, you're all on the same side, really, aren't you? You're all just British. But, the Iroquois had always, at the same time, noted that the attitude of the colonial government and settlers was somewhat different to that of emissaries directly sent from the Crown. When the colonies officially revolted against the Crown in 1776, which I'm using as the proper start date where they officially cut the ties and go to war and stuff, and he felt that the natural course for the League would be to return to neutrality, to be honest. Yet others saw the danger for the Iroquois should the rebels win, because the rebels, i.e. people living in the colonies, were known to be rather keen on snatching up land, whereas the British government, there was a slight distinction because they were more interested in allies and trade and stuff like that. And just one of the many sort of disconnects between colony and crown that actually led to this war was the fact that the colonies wanted to press into the Ohio, and the British government were a little nervous about that because they knew that was mostly owned by various American Indian nations. So that's actually a whole different topic of why the revolution started and stuff like that. But moving on with the Iroquois, so there were factions within the Iroquois that thought that mostly the Mohawks and stuff like that who said, well, we're friends with the British. If they need us, we should help them. Because these colonists just aren't trustworthy at all, and we can do a better deal with the Crown than we can with, say, Virginia or New York or something like that. And the biggest surprise actually came when it turned out that the Oneida and Tuscarora nations of the Confederacy were actually in sympathy with the separatists, because they had been under the influence of some rather charismatic colonial missionaries who had made pretty effective inroads into those two nations. Therefore, there's already the threat of the League being split, and therefore actually that allows the neutral party, mostly centered around a faction of Seneca sachems, like Old Smoke and war chiefs like a guy called Corn Planter, to kind of keep them out of the early part of the war. And as Corn Planter told the council, war is war, death is death, and fight is a hard a fight is a hard business. So let's not get into this too quickly, guys. The League told the U.S. Congress at Oswego in 1775 that they would not take up the hatchet against anybody. Old Smoke went so far as to personally go to dissuade warriors already joining combat groups along the New York and Pennsylvania frontier, but ties to the British were still quite strong. And obviously, as an example, we need only go back to our friend Joseph Brant, who was the 13-year-old warrior at Lake George, son of Molly Brant, and obviously a sort of stepson to William Johnson. He was like really had really strong connections to the Johnson family. And Joseph even traveled to London in 1776 to help William's son Guy get the appointment of Commissioner of Indian Affairs, where he had his portrait painted, and he surprised people and indeed disappointed them for not being savage enough, but because he was quite a genteel guy. But while he was away, the New York legislature of the rebel government targeted Johnson's holdings and arrested the family then still in the state. Now, the Johnsons are pretty much considered sort of de facto members of the Confederacy, or at least under their protection. And it was deemed, this strike was deemed a strike against the Iroquois, and was saw as a contravention of the treaty that they had kind of signed in 1775. It was an insult. It was a slap in the face to the Iroquois that this had happened, because Johnson's house was pretty much on their lands as well. So this was a big breaking point. Now, the League's political divisions became very plain now, with the Seneca, Cayuga, Mohawk, and Onondaga nations siding directly with the British, but the Oneida and the Tuscarora sided with the separatists. In 1777, the four pro-Crown nations took up the hatchet in support of their allies, and tragically, the other two provided warriors to the rebels. This despite the fact that Congress had saw the policy of the British recruiting warriors of indigenous nations as an essential war crime. And it is even cited in the Declaration of Independence as one of the tyrannical aspects of British rule. They probably should have seen some writing on the wall there, but unfortunately, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Still, there was some hope that the opposing nations would act as the Mohawks had at Lake George in 1755, when the pro-French had refused to participate against their brothers. But even more tragically, during St. Leger's expedition, which was part of Burgoyne's 1777 Saratoga campaign, the warriors of the Oneida Nation actually fired upon their Confederates at the Battle of Oriskany, and this symbolically brought an end to Deganawada's centuries-old law, as fellow Iroquois League members shot and killed each other for another guy's war. Brant and his Johnson kin teamed up with the Butler clan, which was a very famous Tory loyalist clan family, and their war bands of rangers and warriors terrorized the northern frontier between 1777 and 1778. And George Washington ordered General Sullivan to totally destroy as many towns as possible in the Iroquois heartlands, and to likewise take as many prisoners as possible of any age and sex. With only a small force of Tory allies, the Iroquois were unable to prevent Sullivan's column from doing just that. Even the non-interventionists, like Old Smoke and Corn Planter, now saw the writing on the wall. They fought courageously alongside Brant's rival Red Jacket, but in vain, to save their homes. The mass destruction Sullivan caused along the southern shores of the Great Lakes effectively smashed the power of the Confederacy as a political entity forever, driving the majority of the survivors into Canada, who, deprived of shelter and food, would have a hard time surviving the winter. Brant and other war leaders continued to fight thereafter, and they literally brought fire and destruction down on the settlements of the Oneida, just further deepening the wounds within the Confederacy itself. And it's almost like a resumption of the old morning wars before the League united. Brant actually became one of the most feared and reviled figures of the war because of his actions on the frontier. He's right up there with creations of patriot propaganda like Bannister Tarleton as a monstrous savage. Incidentally, since the 1750s, George Washington had been known to the Iroquois by the name of town burner. So, that goes both ways. But when the war ended, Brant and the Butlers and the Johnsons had laid waste to over 50,000 miles of colonial land between the Ohio and Mohawk rivers. But it wasn't enough. The British made peace 1783, I believe, and the League stayed split as the result of a civil war within a civil war.
Zach just looks disgusted.
Yeah, if there's people know by now, if they've listened to enough of Sharpshooters, if there's one thing that I can't despise enough, it's hypocrisy. And so if you really want to class the British drawing on the Iroquois as a war crime, fine. Build your argument for that. But don't then go and conduct your own war crime against those people in the process. The British aren't angels by any means at any point in their history, but that's basically a genocide right at the start of the American story.
Yes. It's very controversial to call it that because it's George Washington, and you'll get a lot of hate for that, but it is essentially yes. Yes, it is.
Although we did the worst president, and someone Beth did Washington for a laugh, and actually did not draw as much ire from the Americans in the room as you thought she might, because they acknowledged that he had some dickish qualities.
Well, this was definitely one of them.
So what becomes of the Iroquois' descendants? Where are they railroaded to, and where are they now?
The schism in the Iroquois would last a long time.
Mm-hmm.
The British government in London didn't make a great effort to compensate them, even though they had lost everything in the war with the United States, although they did allow them to settle in Canada, which is where they ferried a lot of loyalists after the war. It has to be said that even that the Oneida and Tuscarora did come to sort of regret their decision as time went on, because it became increasingly obvious that the United States was really not interested in treating them as allies. They just wanted the land. And two leagues, therefore, kind of arose and were set up. Sort of two lesser Onondagas were created as a result of this. So the royal government in Canada was relied on to provide for the Iroquois, basically. And in 1784, the Haldimand Proclamation gave a large grant of land to the surviving members of the League that had fought for the British. Brant, our boy Joseph, tried to reform a nucleus of the dispossessed League around his base at Grand River, which was in this territory, founding a community of around 1,800 people in 1785, which is now called Brantford in his honour. It's in Ontario. He was a vital hinge for the Iroquois in terms of their for continuing existence. He was something that they could sort of rely on as a figure, and a significant player, therefore, for their survival as a nation. In 1802, he moved. He sort of, I think, he built an estate, I think, on Lake Ontario. He was something of a modernist, and he lived the rest of his life actually in more or less European style, and spent a lot of time trying to produce a prayer book in the Mohawk language and learn Greek. And although he would later stir critics for allowing white settlers to occupy portions of his land, he did try and look out for his nation until he died in 1807. Another civil and war leader who did a lot of work to try and rectify the situation post-war was Red Jacket, who I mentioned earlier. He was a great statesman of the Seneca, although later in his life stricken by alcoholism and the grief of having his children succumb to disease. He was, however, instrumental in negotiations with the United States when the war ended. The success of the American Revolution, however, had broken, as we've said, the Great League. And for the Haudenosaunee, as they call themselves, left in the USA, things didn't pan out as they had hoped. The fertile land that their women had cultivated for centuries, and I should also point out, a big part of Iroquois culture here is that the men do the hunting and the fighting, the women make a lot of the political decisions and farm the land.
Mm.
This was coveted by the Americans, this land. The Treaty of Stanwix, 1784, and Canadaga, in 1794, deprived the Seneca of much of their land in western New York and Pennsylvania. Many Oneidas, who were the biggest supporters of the Americans, moved to live with the Onondaga in Canada. Eventually, some Oneidas stayed in New York until the 1830s, until they were moved on to Wisconsin when the U.S. government's Indian policy removed as many Indians as possible, as west as possible, and
put them in places where they could just achieve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any that were left behind naturally then picked up and left for Ontario in the 1840s.
It's just point that we all have our head in our hands at this point.
When the majority of old Iroquois land was sold off under pressure from the governor of New York. The Tuscarora were settled in a reservation near Niagara. Seneca and Cayuga kind of grimly held on to the diminishing land in New York, with many warriors becoming farmers. As private companies continued to buy up their holdings, oddly enough, some salvation came in the form of some missionaries of Quaker persuasion, along with the missionary Asher Wright, managed to keep the Allegheny and Cattaraugus reservations from being gobbled up by fraudulent businessmen. Many also sheared off to go to Oklahoma. The doggedly loyalist Mohawks ended up in Canada with Brant and escaped much of the chiseling as a result. But it's not good by any stretch of description. The Confederacy itself is split by faction and distance across half the country, and they're packaged in dwindling reservations. The future, it's looking pretty dim. But actually, the story of the Iroquois does go on. No, not surprisingly, they no longer form a formidable military force, though many warriors did participate in some way during the War of 1812, except for the Catholic Iroquois, who sided with the French way back in the day and became neutral. But again, in disappointingly typical fashion, they then suffer from both sides because they didn't fight. The Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, were dissuaded from joining the fellow nations in struggles against the U.S. in the 1790s. But the League basically remained split between Canada and America, with the branches spread various places due to the ongoing appropriation of indigenous land by the United States in the 19th century. The survival of the tribe to this day is a remarkable story in itself of resilience. But it still has various centers in the United States and Canada. Interestingly enough, I'll give you two examples of some things that happened afterwards, which are quite interesting. So when Khartoum came under siege by the Mahdi's forces in the 1880s, I believe it was, the Golden Relief Column needed experienced boatmen to get them down the Nile. And they turned to the Canadians, and 100 or so Iroquois boatmen therefore sailed to Egypt to help convey the British Army to Khartoum.
With my man.
That's the one. And also there's also the great figure of a very notable guy who came to prominence in the 1860s, and his name was Eli Parker of the Seneca, who was Ulysses S. Grant's military secretary during the Civil War. It was Parker who wrote out the terms of Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox in April 1865. effectively ending the US Civil War. And he became Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1869. On the day of Lee's surrender, the Confederate general was somewhat perturbed by the dark-skinned man in the blue coat, but relaxed somewhat when he discovered that Parker was a Native American. Parker later told the story to anybody who would hear it a little like this, which were, quote, Lee extended his hand and said, "I am glad to see one real American here." I shook his hand and said, "We are all Americans." Because you see, through it all, the heart of the story of the Iroquois is one rooted in unity.
Josh, well done. I love that you always bring a really challenging subject with impossible pronunciation and just do it anyway, rather than going for the easy. Yeah, I'll just do some Tudor stuff. Let's do I love your complete determination to be as awkward as possible, because History Hack benefits every time. Thank you so much.
Oh, always a pleasure. Absolutely, always a pleasure to come back and talk about these things. You'll probably never hear me talking about Tudors, but
I'll screw the Tudors. Making hand gestures. We have enough Tudors. We have enough people talking about the Tudors. No, as always, it's great to learn about different people and different areas and different ethnicities and races with you. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure, as I said. I'm sure I'll be back with other random stuff.
I've scheduled you in twice more already.
Yeah, although we're back in Europe next, I think. We're doing some swashbuckling.
We are, because you got into a Twitter thing and now you want to talk about Dumas and the Musketeers.
I do. It's one of my soft spots. Brilliant. So we're going to be massacring some French pronunciation. We all know how the French love that.
You can help us at History Hack by joining us via Patreon. It takes quite a lot of effort and a lot of work of quite a big team now to keep us going. And so if you could donate as little as £3 a month, it would be massively appreciated by all of us. There's different levels because Princess Marcus has set it all up with varying rewards and things. So do have a look, do join us. There's an exclusive Facebook group as well, and you can be part of all of it.
When our guests join us to talk about their work and their new book, the 45 minutes or so they spend with us is just a taster of all their efforts. So to this end, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest and greatest books. You can support them and you can support History Hack too. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep at it and bring you more amazing guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/hack history, or just search on bookshop.org for us under the shops bit. Thank you for your continued support, and here's to your next great